The first scream came from something with too many teeth, and it echoed across the training valley just as Instructor Karathek announced, with bored satisfaction, that the survival timer had begun. 48 hours, the instructor said, wings folding neatly behind his armored back. Survive or be academically eliminated. The alien cadets scattered instantly, chitin clicking, tails lashing, plasma tools humming to life, while the lone human remained standing in the drop zone, helmet tucked under one arm, staring at the jungle like it had personally insulted him. Elias Romero had signed up for the Interstellar Expeditionary Academy because the brochure promised adventure, danger, and character building, not because he enjoyed being dropped on a Class 7 death world with creatures that evolved specifically to murder things that screamed. The planet was called Garuin by the locals, though no locals lived within 500 kilometers of the training grounds anymore, which Elias considered an ominous footnote rather than a fun fact. The sky was purple, the trees were tall enough to blot out the sun, and the undergrowth shifted in ways that suggested it was hungry. Karathek watched Elias for a moment longer, multifaceted eyes narrowing. The human was smaller than most cadets, soft-skinned, no claws, no venom, no natural armor, and no obvious survival adaptations beyond stubborn posture. Statistically, he should have been the first casualty. That, Karathek suspected, was precisely why the human had been assigned alone. Humans were an educational curiosity, and occasionally, a cautionary tale. The first apex predator revealed itself with theatrical timing, bursting from the tree-line in a blur of muscle and bone plates, 6 legs churning, jaws splitting open to reveal rotating rows of serrated teeth. Several alien cadets screamed again and fled in different directions, which the creature seemed to appreciate as it chose a target at random. Elias did not run. He raised one hand palm out and said, "Whoa, easy there, big guy," in the same tone he used on stray dogs back home. This was the moment the betting pool began. Across the observation platforms high above the valley, instructors and analysts leaned forward. Some laughed. Some placed wagers. One medic quietly prepped a body retrieval drone. Elias, meanwhile, slowly crouched, making himself smaller, keeping eye contact, and speaking in a calm, steady stream of nonsense words that meant nothing in any known galactic language but seemed to mean something to him. The predator skidded to a halt, confused, claws digging trenches into the soil, head tilting as it assessed whether this strange, hairless thing was prey, threat, or insane. The second apex predator made its entrance by dropping from the canopy, wings snapping open at the last second to slow its descent. It shrieked, a sound sharp enough to vibrate bones, and landed between Elias and the first creature, asserting dominance with a display of bioluminescent patterns across its chest. Elias sighed, like a man who had just realized his day was going to be longer than expected. "Okay," he said, voice carrying. "So we're doing this now." The third apex predator had been there the whole time. It emerged silently from the shadows behind Elias, a serpentine mass of coiled muscle and sensory fronds, eyes like polished obsidian reflecting the scene with unsettling intelligence. It could have killed him instantly. Instead, it paused, tasting the air, reading the micro-expressions on his face, the tension in his shoulders, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Elias felt the hairs on his neck rise and slowly turned around, very carefully, very deliberately. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Elias did the last thing any survival manual would ever recommend. He sat down. The jungle seemed to hold its breath. The winged predator stopped shrieking. The armored one lowered its head slightly. The serpent uncoiled just enough to bring its massive head level with Elias's face. He reached into his pack and pulled out a ration bar, broke it in half, and placed one piece on the ground between them. "I don't know what you eat," he said softly, "but this is high protein, no artificial colors, and I'm really bad company if you kill me." On the platforms above, silence spread. Karathek's mandibles clicked once in disbelief. The human was not fighting. He was not fleeing. He was negotiating with things that had never needed to negotiate before. When the armored predator sniffed the ration and made a low, curious rumble, the betting pool dissolved into chaos. This was supposed to be a lesson in fear, desperation, and natural selection. It was not supposed to become a demonstration. Elias Romero, dropped into hell with a countdown and an audience, smiled as 3 apex predators slowly settled around him, and wondered absently if the Academy allowed extra credit for community outreach. Above them, the survival clock glowed crimson against the sky, counting down with merciless precision, each second a reminder that instructors expected blood, not bonding. Elias glanced up, then back to the predators, reading posture and breath the way his grandmother had taught him to read horses, bears, and bad men. He spoke again, slower now, promising nothing and offering patience, while the jungle listened and recalculated its assumptions about humans. Somewhere, a drone recalibrated its casualty estimate, and the instructors realized, too late, that the lesson was changing, because the human hadn't been told to win, only to survive. Survival on Garuin had always meant teeth, claws, and terror, but Elias felt something else stirring, a fragile truce built on tone, stillness, and respect. The predators shifted closer, curious rather than enraged, and the valley seemed less hostile for the first time. 48 hours stretched ahead, long and dangerous, yet suddenly full of possibilities. Elias took a breath, smiled wider, and thought that if he survived, the debrief was going to be very, very strange, especially when he explained the petting zoo idea that was already forming in his head, quietly, carefully, impossibly alive with hope. By the time the first hour ticked off the survival clock, the valley no longer sounded like a hunting ground and more like a confused committee meeting where no one shared a language. Elias remained seated in the dirt, legs crossed, while the 3 apex predators formed an uneven triangle around him, each reassessing the rules of existence in real time. The armored hexapod kept scraping the ground with one claw, the winged shrieker folded its membrane wings in and out like it couldn't decide whether to leave or stay, and the massive serpent kept its head low, eyes fixed on Elias with unsettling focus. On the observation platforms, the instructors began arguing. "This violates every risk model," snapped Professor Thalquan, a reptilian xenobiologist whose tail lashed against the railing. "The human should be dead." Krrthek did not respond immediately. He watched Elias toss another broken ration piece, this time farther away, subtly encouraging space. "Or," the instructor said slowly, "the human is exploiting a behavioral loophole we do not understand." Down below, that loophole was currently chewing on compressed soy protein and making a pleased rumbling sound. The second problem arrived without a roar. It arrived as silence. Every insect sound vanished. The foliage stilled. The predators around Elias froze, muscles tensing in perfect unison. Elias noticed instantly. Earth animals did that too. When the background went quiet, something worse was coming. He rose slowly to one knee, palms open, heart thudding, scanning the treeline until he saw movement that didn't belong. The 4th apex predator. This one didn't look like a predator so much as a moving absence, a distortion in the air shaped vaguely like a quadruped with too many joints. Light bent around it. Sensors on the observation platform screamed warnings as it phased in and out of visibility, a natural ambush specialist that hunted other apex predators for sport. Several instructors cursed at once. This was not scheduled. This was not fair, even by Academy standards. Elias swallowed. "Okay," he murmured, voice low. "New rule. Enemy of my enemy, yeah?" The serpent was the first to react. It slid forward, placing its massive body partially in front of Elias, sensory fronds flaring wide. The winged shrieker took off in a burst of air, circling above, screams shifting pitch into something sharper, more aggressive. The armored hexapod planted itself solidly, lowering its head like a living shield. The instructors went silent. What followed was not a clean fight. It was chaos layered on instinct layered on something new and fragile. The phase predator lunged, clipping the winged creature midair and sending it crashing through branches. Elias didn't think, he moved. He grabbed a fist-sized rock and hurled it, not at the predator, but at a cluster of bioluminescent fungi nearby. The explosion of light drew attention, confusing the phase predator just long enough for the serpent to strike, coils slamming into distorted flesh with bone-cracking force. Elias shouted, words meaningless but loud, arms waving, making himself visible, present, impossible to ignore. Earth logic applied, be predictable, be part of the environment, don't act like prey. The armored hexapod charged, slamming the phased predator sideways, while the winged shrieker recovered and dove, talons raking through shimmering air. The fight ended as abruptly as it began. The phased predator retreated, phasing out in jagged flashes, injured and clearly re-evaluating its life choices. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the winged predator landed heavily near Elias, chest heaving, one membrane torn. Without thinking, Elias approached slowly, tore open a med patch from his kit, and held it up where the creature could see. He waited. The shrieker hesitated, then lowered its injured wing. On the platforms above, someone dropped a data slate. As Elias applied the patch with careful, clumsy movements, the survival challenge escalated around him. Night fell fast on Garuin, bringing freezing temperatures and glowing predators that hunted by heat signature. Elias built a fire not just for warmth, but for visibility, arranging stones and branches in a circle that none of the predators crossed, though they sat just beyond it, watching. When another smaller predator crept too close, the serpent snapped once, a warning, and the thing fled. By hour 12, the instructors had stopped pretending this was normal. "He's not surviving," Falquan whispered. "He's integrating." The complications kept coming. Acid rain hissed against leaves. Tremors shook the ground. Automated drones sent to observe were swatted out of the air by the winged predator with alarming accuracy. Elias adapted constantly, using his environment, sharing water, breaking food evenly, mimicking calm behaviors. He slept in short bursts, back against the armored creature's warm plating, waking at every unfamiliar sound. At some point, a junior instructor muttered, "Is that a schedule?" Because Elias had started a routine. Feed, patrol, rest. He used gestures and tone, not dominance but consistency. The predators responded, not obediently, but cooperatively. They were not pets. They were partners in an absurd social experiment unfolding under a ticking clock. When dawn broke on the second day, the valley looked different. Not safer. Just organized. Elias stood, stretching sore muscles, and looked up at the glowing survival timer. 36 hours remained. He exhaled slowly, scanning his unlikely allies, noting injuries, positions, moods. He felt fear, yes, but beneath it was something steadier, a growing understanding that survival here wasn't about killing what threatened you, but convincing it that you belong. High above, Instructor Kaarathek finally spoke into the recorder, voice tight with disbelief. "Subject demonstrates extreme adaptability, cross-species empathy, and a complete disregard for expected outcomes," he said. "Recommend reassessment of all human survival protocols." Below, Elias smiled faintly as the serpent nudged his shoulder, not gently, but deliberately, and the jungle prepared its next test, already uncertain whether this human was prey, predator, or something far more dangerous to established assumptions. The warning did not come from the survival clock, the instructors, or even the jungle itself, but from the three apex predators all reacting at once with a violence of motion that snapped Elias fully awake from a half-sleep. The serpent surged upright, body coiling into a defensive spiral. The armored hexapod slammed its claws into the ground hard enough to crack stone. The winged shrieker launched skyward in silence, wings slicing the air without a single cry. Elias was on his feet before he consciously understood why, heart pounding, hand closing around the last flare in his kit. Something vast was moving. The ground trembled, not in short bursts like the earlier seismic shifts, but in a slow, rhythmic pulse that felt deliberate. Trees bent outward as if pushed aside by an invisible tide. The jungle did not go quiet this time, it screamed. Creatures fled in every direction, stampeding blindly, some crushed under massive unseen weight. Elias climbed onto a boulder without thinking, scanning the horizon until the treelines split apart, and the apex of apex predators emerged. It was colossal, easily the size of a dropship, its body a living fortress of bone ridges and layered muscle, for primary limbs ending in hammer-like claws, with a massive head crowned by sensory horns that glowed a dull, predatory red. This was not a hunter. This was a territorial engine of extinction, the final argument of evolution on Garuin. Academy files called it a sovereign-class megafauna. Cadets called it a death sentence. On the observation platforms, alarms blared. "That's not in the simulation parameters!" Falquan shouted. Krth stared, frozen. "If it claims the valley, nothing survives." Below, Elias swallowed hard. Fear surged, cold and sharp, but it didn't paralyze him. He'd grown up around wild things on Earth, had learned early that panic was loud and predators listened for it. He forced himself to breathe slowly, deeply, grounding himself as the megafauna lowered its massive head and released a sound that vibrated through bone and soil alike. The three apex predators hesitated. Elias saw it instantly, the subtle shift in posture, the instinctual recognition of something that sat above them in the food chain. They were brave, powerful, deadly, but this thing was dominance made flesh. If it attacked, they would fight, and they would die. "No," Elias whispered, not to the creature advancing, but to his allies. He stepped forward, placing himself between them and the megafauna, arms spread wide in a gesture that made several instructors gasp. This was not courage. This was necessity. He triggered the flare and hurled it high into the air. It burst into blinding red light, bathing the clearing in harsh illumination. The megafauna paused, sensory horns flaring brighter as it processed the sudden stimulus. Elias seized the moment. He shouted not words, but tone, loud and commanding, the same way park rangers on Earth used to deter bears. He stamped his foot against stone, making himself impossible to ignore. The megafauna focused on him. The pressure of its attention was suffocating. Elias felt like a mouse staring down a collapsing mountain, but he did not back away. Behind him, the serpent hissed, the armored creature shifted anxiously, and the winged shrieker circled, uncertain. Elias raised both hands slowly, deliberately, showing empty palms, then lowered himself to one knee. Submission. The instructors erupted into shouting. "He's surrendering!" "No, he's provoking it!" Elias ignored them all. He pressed his fist to the ground, then to his chest, then extended his arm outward, mimicking territorial acknowledgement gestures he'd seen across species. It was a gamble built on fragments of xenobiology lectures and gut instinct. The megafauna leaned closer, massive head lowering until its breath blasted over him, hot and metallic, knocking him backward onto the stone. Pain flared. Fear spiked. Then the armored hexapod moved. It stepped forward, placing itself partially beside Elias rather than behind him, not attacking, but aligning. The serpent followed, coiling protectively. Above, the winged shrieker let out a single piercing cry, not aggressive, but declarative, echoing across the valley like a challenge wrapped in loyalty. The megafauna stopped. For the first time since it appeared, it hesitated. What it saw was not prey, not rivals, but a coalition that should not exist, unified around a fragile, defiant human. Elias forced himself to stand, legs shaking, blood trickling from his scalp, and slowly reached into his pack. He pulled out the last ration bar, crushed it between his hands, and scattered the pieces on the ground. An offering. The megafauna's sensory horns dimmed slightly as it assessed the scene. Seconds stretched into eternities. Then, with a sound like mountains grinding together, it withdrew. One massive step back. Then another. Finally it turned, vanishing into the jungle it ruled, leaving destruction and silence in its wake. Elias collapsed to his knees, breath coming in ragged bursts. On the platforms above, no one spoke. The survival clock continued its relentless countdown, but the meaning of the challenge had shifted irrevocably. Elias looked up at his three companions, battered alive, watching him with something dangerously close to trust. He laughed, a shaky, incredulous sound, and pressed his forehead briefly to the cool ground. The greatest threat Garuin could produce had come, tested them, and chosen to leave. Not because of strength alone, but because of unity that defied natural law. As the jungle slowly resumed its chaotic rhythm, Elias realized the truth with startling clarity. He hadn't just survived the challenge. He had rewritten it. The valley did not celebrate their survival. It simply accepted it, which on Garuin was the closest thing to respect. Morning light filtered through broken canopy leaves, illuminating scars in the earth where the sovereign-class megafauna had passed, and Elias woke to the strange realization that nothing was trying to kill him at that exact moment. He lay still for a few seconds, listening, cataloging sounds the way he'd learned to do over the past 2 days. Wind through leaves. Distant calls. The slow, steady breathing of 3 apex predators who had chosen to sleep near him rather than anywhere else in a jungle full of options. The survival clock pulsed overhead. 6 hours remained. On the observation platforms, the instructors were no longer arguing about theory. They were arguing about damage control. "This footage cannot be released unedited," Thalquan hissed, eyes fixed on the feeds. "It undermines half of xenobiology doctrine." Kaarathek did not look away. "It exposes faulty doctrine," he corrected quietly. "That is not the same thing." Below, Elias sat up, joints aching, hair stiff with dried blood and dirt. The winged shrieker stirred first, folding and unfolding its wings, then hopped closer, head cocked expectantly. Elias smiled despite himself and reached out slowly, scratching the thick ridge beneath its jaw where he knew, now, it tolerated touch. The creature made a low, pleased sound that sent ripples of disbelief through the monitoring teams. The next test came not from the jungle, but from the academy. A dropship roared overhead, deliberately loud, descending toward the valley floor with searchlights blazing. Standard extraction protocol. The noise triggered immediate reactions. The armored hexapod rose defensively, the serpent's coils tightened, and the shrieker launched into the air with an angry scream. Elias stood quickly, arms raised, heart lurching. "No," he said firmly, projecting calm he barely felt. "It's okay. It's loud, not hostile." The dropship continued its descent. That was when Elias understood the final complication. Extraction meant separation. Separation meant panic. Panic here meant blood. He sprinted toward the clearing where the ship would land, waving both arms, shouting at the descending craft. "Abort landing! Hold altitude! You're going to get someone killed!" "Cadet Romero," crackled a voice over the loudspeakers, strained with disbelief. "Stand down and prepare for retrieval." Elias turned back to his companions, saw fear there now, raw and instinctual, and made a decision that would echo far beyond the valley. He planted himself between the predators and the ship, spreading his arms wide, shaking his head. "I'm not leaving like this," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "Not reminding them why they should fear the sky." The instructors froze. "What is he doing?" someone whispered. Kaarathek's mandibles clicked slowly. "Teaching." Elias signaled the shrieker to land. It hesitated, then obeyed. He placed one hand on its chest, the other raised toward the ship, a bridge between worlds. He knelt again, slow and deliberate, lowering his profile, breathing deeply until the tension eased just enough. Minutes passed. Finally, the dropship powered back up, lifting away, lights dimming, retreating to a safer distance. The jungle exhaled. The survival clock ticked down to 0 and silence. When the all-clear signal sounded, it felt almost anticlimactic. Elias didn't cheer. He didn't collapse. He simply sat there, back against the armored creature's warm plating, eyes closed, absorbing the reality that he was alive and that survival, for once, hadn't required anyone to lose. The official debrief lasted 6 hours. Elias sat in a sterile room, wrapped in a blanket, facing a semicircle of instructors, analysts, and administrators who could not quite decide whether he was a genius, a liability, or a walking policy violation. Footage replayed again and again, each viewing revealing details no one wanted to explain away. "You were instructed to survive," Thalquan said finally. "Not to form attachments." Elias shrugged. "You didn't say how." Silence followed. The decision came 3 days later. The Academy would not classify the event as a failure. It would not classify it as a standard success either. They created a new category, hastily named and poorly defined, then quietly rewrote training manuals to include a footnote about humans and unpredictable social bonding under extreme stress. As for the valley on Garuin, it was reclassified as a protected research zone. Elias returned one last time, escorted, not armed. The predators were there, watching from a distance, alert but calm. He didn't cross the boundary. He didn't try to touch. He simply sat, the way he had at the beginning, and let them see him as he was now, not a desperate survivor, but a choice made real. The serpent lifted its head once, acknowledging. The armored hexapod scraped the ground, a familiar sound. The shrieker cried softly, then turned away. Elias smiled, stood, and left. Back at the academy, cadets whispered about the human who turned a Deathworld into a temporary sanctuary, who survived not by domination, but by understanding. Instructor stopped saying, "Apex Predator," like it meant the end of a conversation. And Elias Romero, once considered fragile and statistically doomed, became something far more unsettling to the galaxy at large. Proof that the most dangerous thing humans brought to the stars wasn't weapons or ships or stubborn resilience. It was the idea that even monsters might choose peace, if someone was brave enough to sit down, stay calm, and treat them like they mattered.